Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I am very happy to have our guest joining us today once more, Constantin Von Hoffmeister. He is the founder of Multipolar Press. You can find them online. They're brand new and going to be publishing a lot of great work very soon. I'm excited to see where this all leads. Constantin, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Yes, it's always good to have a fellow third worldist, as they say on the show. What is going on right now? I want to start off with, I guess, the distinction that people are trying to draw between what they're dubbing civilizational resistance and the multipolar world. And just, if I may, I don't really understand this distinction, because if you look at the foundations of multipolar theory, everything it is about civilization states rising up, asserting their sovereignty, asserting their own national tradition, their history. And that could potentially include the West, if it actually achieves true sovereignty. So what is going on here? Is there a distinction that I'm missing out on?
Well, I would say that civilizational resistance is basically the spirit and multipolarity is the structure, because civilizational resistance is when you have traditional rooted cultures revolting against the homogenizing globalist liberal steamroller, basically. As we can see happening in the Sahel states, for example, in Africa with Maduro in Venezuela, and China, Russia. So all these people are sick and tired of the liberal world order. Multipolarity is when you have these poles actually asserting their sovereignty in a new framework. So I think right now we have China as a pole, we have Russia as a pole, and we have India as a pole, right? So we have three poles, I would say three civilization states at the moment, right, in this multipolar world. But I think the multipolar world is growing, so new poles will be added very soon.
Mm-hmm. And I think something that people might be fearful of when they hear anyone talk about Africa or India, they're fearful of migrants from these countries. But would you say that it's within the tradition of pro-sovereignty movements in these regions, in these civilization states, like India or like a Pan-African Union, to oppose the mass immigration of their own citizens to the West, especially those who have higher levels of intellect related or compared to the broader populations in their own regions? I mean, why would they want people to leave rather than build their country and their future?
Well, I think in the new multipolar world, we're seeing a going back to sovereignty. So these cultures and these civilizations are trying to build the necessary infrastructure to keep people at home and prevent the sort of brain drain that's been happening now for decades, when the smartest people are leaving the country and migrating to the West and setting up shop there. So I think the problem of migration is directly linked to liberal universalism, basically, because you have this notion right now, which is still very prevalent, but thankfully it's changing, that the Western way of life, liberalism, democracy, is the only way of life, the only valid one. I mean, it is sort of like an obsession, right? I mean, everybody wants to be democratic. Everybody wants to be a democracy. I mean, I think this obsession with calling yourself a democracy, or at least have the veneer of being democratic, started after 1945. I mean, you had like the German Democratic Republic, for example, right? So everything has to be democratic, but in a Western sense. Everything has to be liberal values, feminism, LGBTQ, trans, etc., all that nonsense, yes? So all of this has to be imposed on the whole world. And a lot of people, I think, not just in the West, but also in what people call the global South, or maybe quote unquote the third world, have also somehow internalized these values, especially the elites in these countries. And I think by going back to a more traditional way of life, sort of reasserting their own heritage. These countries like Modi's India, like reasserting Hindu civilization, or Russia reasserting Orthodox civilization, China, Confucianism, I think they're attracting more people to stay in their place, basically. I think it's becoming also more fashionable to sort of celebrate your own traditions, more so than it was like only recently, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think it is that people in the West who are objectively opposed to mass migration, the globalist order, liberal hegemony, why do you think it is that they have such a problem with, us, for example, supporting these movements for sovereignty in the multipolar world? Why do they try to smear it, to label it third worldism? What is behind this?
Yeah, I think it's a misinterpretation and a sort of misunderstanding. So if you look at, say, the conservative right or the nationalist right, they describe third worldism as basically the third world demanding charity from the West, and the West giving like unending donations to Africa, for example. And they also argue that third worldism means unlimited immigration into the West from third world countries. But I think this is false, yes, because third worldism, according to my interpretation and the interpretation of a lot of other, even conservative thinkers, is that it is a civilizational struggle against the global hegemon, against the global liberal hegemon. So you can go back to Weimar Germany, for example, like 100 years ago. You had Ernst Niekisch. He was a national Bolshevik thinker, incarcerated by the Nazis during the Third Reich, and he advocated Germany joining the Soviet Union and the colonized and oppressed peoples of the South against the Western hegemon, which then was Britain and the United States, because he back then already understood, at least at the time, that Germany, as a Central European country, was not a Western country, and mentally and psychologically, according to him, was more closely aligned with the Russian spirit. And he thought that Soviet Russia exemplified sort of like the Prussian spirit that animated the German soul. And therefore he thought that an alliance between Germany and Soviet Russia, together with the great Eurasian peoples and the oppressed peoples of the global South, against this Atlanticist beast, Leviathan, basically, was the way to go. And he said this 100 years ago in the 1920s and maybe early 1930s, but I think it has not lost its relevance, because we're in exactly the same situation now. And when Alexander Dugin, just a few days ago, he said, yes, we are third worldists and we are for third worldism. I mean, he literally said it on X. And I agree with him, because basically what we should do is we should reclaim the term third worldism. It is not like a bad word or a term that you use to smear people. I think it is a term that should be appropriated with pride and should be displayed also with pride. It just means that we as Westerners, we are in solidarity with the third world peoples, in the sense that we as true Westerners, as true Europeans, also oppose this Atlanticist, American dominated liberal system that wants to enslave the entire planet, basically.
And going beyond that, because you'll have a lot of nationalists in the West. They'll say, well, you can have your moral outrage about what the US or the UK is doing in Africa or India or wherever. I don't care about that. They'll say this. But going beyond that, couldn't you argue that Hezbollah fighting against the Israelis and the US empire is, it's a common struggle against this same beast that is oppressing Americans at home? I mean, what are they missing here? Why do they struggle to understand that there are brothers in a common struggle in Russia and China and elsewhere all across the multipolar world who are fighting the same beasts that they're trying to fight at home, this liberal globalist system?
Well, it's because they're brainwashed, obviously, and everything is still sort of put into civilizational terms in the West. Basically, liberalism is still white supremacism. I mean, that's the argument I've been making for a while. I mean, back then you had Rudyard Kipling writing the poem during the heyday of British imperialism called White Man's Burden, right? I mean, Rudyard Kipling is famous for having written the Jungle Book, but he was also a great proponent of British imperialism and basically argued that it is the white man's duty to, I don't know, civilize the savages and basically lift them up so they can become as enlightened as the white man, basically. And I mean, of course, back then it was viewed through a racial lens, obviously. Now you have the liberals that claim to be anti-racist, right? We're not racists. Everybody's equal. We're all the same. But in reality, they're still racist because they still want to impose Western values on other countries that resist these Western values, that are not even interested in acquiring these Western values. I mean, the Taliban is a good example. I mean, I would argue that the Taliban is probably well liked in Afghanistan by the majority of the Afghan people. And I would even argue that rightfully so. Why not? I think it suits their traditions. It suits their way of life. Who are we to judge the Afghans what kind of government they choose? Or who are we to judge the North Koreans? Because I think the North Korean system is wonderful for the North Korean people. Why not? And this is basically the main message of multipolarity. We have to respect the way of life of other peoples. We have to stop this liberal racism of trying to impose our Western way of life by force, through dropping bombs and shooting missiles. We have basically need, instead of one universal hegemon, which has been the United States until very recently, we need to replace the universal hegemon with regional hegemons so we can guarantee separate but equal development and more respect between cultures instead of this imperialist domination that tries to level the entire planet and make it uniform.
You've drawn the ire of a lot of these white nationalists over the past week. I'm curious, though, what is their solution to the problems that are actually facing the United States or Europe? Other than going out and having these, LARP protests and marches and things of this nature. I mean, do they propose any sort of fundamental systemic changes to the existing order, governance, economy, anything of this nature to assert their own values and sovereignty?
Well, I think they mostly live in a fantasy world because you have this whole idea of remigration, which is like gaining a lot of traction on social media, especially X, where people post all kinds of memes, send them back home, airplanes with pretty women as stewardesses, full of Arabs or blacks, flying back to their respective countries. I mean, this is their vision. This is what they want. They want, and they think that it's feasible to send back home millions and millions of non-Europeans, basically, from both Western Europe and the United States. In my opinion, it's not feasible. It's not realistic remigration, simply for logistical reasons. I mean, in the United States, you share a border which is thousands of miles long with Mexico, so you just kick them across the border, basically. But if you look at Germany, for example, it does not share a border with Syria or Afghanistan. So if you have millions of Syrians and Afghans in Germany, how many planes would it take to fly them back to Syria? Not to mention that you'd have to convince the Syrian government and the Afghan governments to even take them back. What if they don't want them back? Are you going to force them? What are you going to do? Right? So, I just simply think it's not feasible. And I think it will not be done. I think the ship has already sailed. Basically, we already have a multi-ethnic Europe, and it will become more multi-ethnic. And this is the present, and this will also be the future. Even more so. So my question is how to make the best of it. To make the best of it is through the lens of multipolarity and ethnopluralism, basically, because the future is not like the future does not consist of ethnically pure nation states, because the Westphalian system of nation states has completely collapsed. The white nationalists or the ethno-nationalists, they believe it still exists. They believe it's still somehow relevant, but it's not, because what is relevant today are empires, or what people now call civilization states. And only those empires are truly sovereign, and only they decide politically what will happen and what won't. And if you look at the white nationalists and the nationalists, they have no real political support in the real world. Like you said, it's LARPers, it's people marching on the street demanding things they will never get, and nobody cares, right? I mean, the governments still repress them in Western Europe because they're hysterical, especially in Germany, France. But again, they mostly tolerate them, but everybody knows it leads nowhere, right? So multipolarity as an ideology or as a philosophy actually has the backing of 3 nuclear powers. I mean, India, Russia, and China, all 3 civilization states explicitly, overtly support the idea of multipolarity. I mean, you have the famous photograph from the summit in Shanghai where Modi, Putin, and Xi basically hugging each other, right? Shaking hands. I mean, this is the future. And if you want a future for your people, say Europeans, or I don't know, white people in America, white Americans, you cannot do it without supporting the sovereignty of other peoples. Because the question is, like, how do Europeans or white Americans benefit from multipolarity? Well, they benefit because multipolarity breaks this spell or the notion that there's only like one linear version of history, the liberal Western one. They have to understand, and people will understand soon, that there is a plurality of civilizations, and there are many different ways of achieving different goals, not just one. And this is the spirit of multipolarity, and I think it's inspiring because it can also inspire the West to finally decouple itself from this universalist project and focus on its own problems, its own civilization. I think Trump, I mean, he's not perfect, he's a human being, nobody's perfect. He has some good ideas, right? I mean, the impulse is good. The idea, I mean, it is often expressed, unfortunately, very often not implemented, but often expressed that America needs to focus on America and not the rest of the world. It needs to stop playing the world's policeman and go into a more isolationist mode, to basically revert back to original American traditions, to truly make America great again by focusing on America, not the rest of the world. Basically, America needs to shed its Messiah complex, and Western Europe needs to do the same.
You know, I never understand this this sort of meme culture around. There's so much support around this meme culture for the remigration. I've seen it. I've discussed it with these AFD politicians and whatnot. But I mean, don't you think that multipolarity, allowing countries to assert their sovereignty and actually develop and build beautiful societies, don't you think that is a better likelihood of actually achieving the results or the goals of these people who want to see remigration? The reason why people leave Africa is because a lot of these countries are shitholes, and that is a result of U.S. imperialism and, Western imperialism as a whole. Okay, so they leave because of the imperialism, and then they don't want to go back because it's still living under imperialism. Why would they go back to that? The only chance that people will stop coming to Europe or will want to go back home is if imperialism crumbles and sovereignty is asserted.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. So basically, like, Well, the nationalists, they don't look at they see the effects. They don't like the effects, which is mass immigration in Western Europe and the United States, but they don't really look at the causes. And you just addressed the root causes. The root causes are basically imperialism and neocolonialism. So you have the presence of the West all over the third world, basically imposing its will by force, bombing people, killing people by the hundreds of thousands, yes, non-stop, basically. And then they complain if these same people come to the West because their country was destroyed by the West. I mean, the West literally destroys nations completely, obliterates them. And then these people migrate to the West because their countries have become shitholes, as you so well put it. So I don't really blame the people. You cannot blame the people. And I don't like the vocabulary that the nationalist right uses very often. For example, they call them invaders, right? But they're not invaders, because what is the definition of an invader? An invader is a person who by force enters your territory against your will, basically, and takes what's yours. That's an invader, right? But these people did not come by force into Europe. They were invited by the European governments, and they're still being invited by the European governments. They're given handouts by the European governments. So the European governments, the Western governments, they're creating incentives for these people to come to Western Europe, obviously for capitalist reasons, because the elite, the corporate elite, the business elite, they benefit from these migrants. I mean, even if a lot of these migrants are unemployed and only live off state benefits, some of them do work and they do suppress wages. And the huge corporations, they don't have to pay the state benefits, the state does, right? They only benefit from the cheap labor, basically. So as long as capitalism is still in charge, nothing, I think, will change regarding immigration. I mean, there's a famous French thinker from the New Right called Alain de Benoit, and he even said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that if you don't want to talk about capitalism, you need to shut up about immigration. Yes, and he's one of the godfathers of the New Right, and by the way, he's also, I mean, a big proponent of multipolarity. And in the 1970s, 1980s, the French New Right basically espoused the same ideas that I am espousing right now, which is solidarity with the third world against the Western hegemon, basically. And they always differentiated between the West and Europe. They said the West is the enemy of Europe, just as the West, as a system, as a liberal system, liberal capitalist system, is the enemy of all peoples.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, about capitalism, what role do you think the science of Marxism, Leninism plays in a multipolar world? Because obviously the US, the Western Empire, they've never been more fearful of any people than the Soviet Union, and today of China and their great power. That a lot of people could say, oh, well, you know, China has such a great population, as did the Soviet Union. But on the flip side, you have India. And India, like a handful of other countries, have only been forced into this position of economic resistance, aligning closer with Russia, now even with China, as a result of Western pressure. It was not any sort of from within sovereigntist movement that really built that. It was a form of pressure and threats imposed upon India, and this is their reaction. How should we look at the development of countries like this in the multipolar world, or of countries like Iran, who still have, you know, a fifth column of, you know, an economic elite that want to unite with the West, versus countries like China or North Korea, which have ingrained in their system a fully independent economic vision that unites with their cultural traditions and their own history that is going to actually safeguard their sovereignty?
Well, it's a very difficult question, to be honest. And I think it's not just India sort of who was pressured into this. I think Russia was as well, to be honest, right? Because before the special military operation, Russia always made advances to the West. It always wanted to integrate with the West. I mean, Putin also was speaking about a great space from Dublin to Vladivostok, basically evoking also the vision of the new right of this Euro-Siberian Empire, right? Because Russia always viewed itself, at least politically and culturally to some extent, as part of the West. And because of the conflict in Ukraine and the West consistently rejecting Russia's advances, I think Russia was also forced basically into embracing this Eastern alliance that it is in right now. I mean, this is how I see it. I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing, though, right? Because I see it as a positive development, because the West, in its current incarnation, in its totally degenerate, liberal, decadent, I mean, sodomy praising self, should never become a partner of a traditional civilization like Russia or China. So these civilizations are right in rejecting the West right now. And I think India, and you're absolutely correct with what you were saying, because I think India, of course, would also rather be with the West than with China, its traditional arch enemy, basically. And I mean, through circumstances, we now see the creation of this multipolar order, mostly because you have these three major poles: Russia, India, China. They're actually the pillars of the multipolar order. And the fact that they're now collaborating and actively ignoring like Western threats, like India and the oil issue, for example, when America said, well, you have to stop, buying Russian oil. And I said, no, we're not going to stop. We're going to do it anyway, right? I mean, would have been unheard of a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. But this is basically new self-confidence of these nations, like to stand up to Western arrogance. And the circumstances, you're right, you described them well, in my opinion, are not so important. What is important is the result. And the result is that now we have a true multipolar order, which is now asserting itself. It's self-confidence against Western hubris.
Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm saying is, do you think that countries like India and even Russia, even though it was obviously its entire existence was threatened by NATO, but do you think countries like this have the discipline and the order to maintain this trend towards sovereignty, despite it not being ingrained from within and it kind of being forced upon them?
Yeah, I think it has to be seen, the development, but I think the spirit is there. And I think even in India, you have a sort of like a socialist tradition, because the Communist Party in India is quite strong. And the communist movements have always been quite strong in India. And socialism also is a major influence on Indian society. I mean, in Russia as well, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is the second strongest party in Russia. And people still remember the Soviet Union, of course, especially the older generation, a lot of them nostalgically. So, well, in China, you have now communism with a Chinese face, the fusion of some sort of private enterprise, but also state control for the benefit of the people. In my opinion, if Russia, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, had followed the same model, it would be a major world power, much more powerful than the Russian Federation is today, but it's not too late. It can still sort of become what it possibly was always meant to be, which is a true empire of world significance and far-reaching influence. So I think the development that BRICS has ushered in, and now the alliance of these three poles, can sort of create a completely renewed world order, especially with China, because as you so correctly posted today on X, that China is the most advanced nation on earth, which is absolutely true. I mean, you look at these videos on X, it's like a science fiction movie. I mean, what's going on in China, right? I mean, some of the things you've never even seen, like, I mean, here, like in Germany, they're importing bus drivers without driving licenses, basically, from Kenya to to drive the decrepit buses, right? And in China, they have these driverless buses, basically. Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, it's super high tech. Why don't we have it here? I don't know. We are really far behind. And I think China taking sort of the lead in this now may influence the other countries like Russia and India in a positive way, especially if trade between these countries is increased, cooperation is increased, and we should also include Africa. I think Africa is very important for demographic reasons, because nobody's basically having any children except Africa, right? So I mean, the African population is exploding and it's shrinking everywhere else, including China, India, and the West. And and then you have the Sahel alliance is a prime example of multipolarity, right? Like Ibrahim Traore, he's a true hero of multipolarity, and he closely works together with Russia. They were talking about building nuclear power plants, satellites, military assistance, food aid. I mean, this is a true collaboration. And the fact that they threw out the French colonizers, I mean, it's an extremely positive development. A lot of people argue that, okay, Russia is coming in as sort of a new colonizer, but it's not the case, right? Because Russia is coming in as a partner, basically, in building up the multipolar world. Because Putin himself said in Shanghai not so long ago, last week, he said that we are not interested in a new hegemon, basically. We're interested in the equality of nations in the new multipolar order, basically. And I think it's not like the silly liberal kind of like egalitarianism he was talking about. I think he was talking just about mutual respect, basically. Respect other cultures, respect the way of life of other peoples, and mind your own business, and be friendly towards other peoples, and trade on an equal level without the arrogance that the West always displays, because the West always thinks that only the West is right and everybody else is wrong.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. Constantine, I want to leave off here by allowing you to have some time to talk about your new project, Multipolar Press. Explain this to me and what people can expect in the near future.
So Multipolar Press is a new company that I founded together with a group of like-minded individuals. And the website already exists, multipolarpress.com. Now it's tied to a Substack, and we publish several articles per day, exclusive articles that you can find nowhere else, articles by Alexander Dugin, Konstantin Malofeev, Rafael Machado, Alexander Markovich from Austria, people from Japan, people from China, people from the Middle East. So it's a truly international project. Now we are going to expand very soon. It will be a proper publishing house, and we are planning to publish 1 or 2 books per month, starting very, very soon. And possibly we'll have podcasts, we will have other features on the website. It's all under active development right now, and well, I will reveal it very soon. But as I said, website already exists, so I welcome everybody to check it out, read the articles, subscribe to the Substack, and I will announce all the changes in a Substack as they appear. I will keep people updated about all the developments. But I'm getting a lot of support from people from all over the world, and I think it will be a major hub, a think tank of multipolar philosophy and multipolar thought. And I think this is especially important today as a counterweight to the liberal mainstream invective against multipolarity, basically. So we want to give multipolarity a voice, not just in a sense of presenting news pieces, but also deep analyses and philosophical background, so people can actually understand where multipolarity comes from historically and philosophically, and how this thought can be applied to overthrow the degenerate modern world and usher in the renewed world order of multipolarity.
Well, I fully support you in that effort. So I'm happy to see this development, and I cannot wait to see where it all goes. So, Constantine, thank you so much for joining me here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for your support. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you in Moscow soon.
Very soon. Very soon.